My name is Kelly Gregory with Missouri Student Mental Health, and we're really happy that you're here today. And this program is the basics of cultural competence. This is part of a parent series that we put together for the spring. We did one on suicide prevention, and we're hopefully going to be doing one on compassion fatigue here shortly as well. I'm just going to read the description for the program. So, recently there's been an assault on the cultural and ethnic values of our country. For a nation that is built on the backs of diverse ethnic and cultural populations, we seem to be becoming less tolerant and accepting of the differences of others, whether this is a result of the intense polarization over political ideologies, the proliferation of social media, the politicization of the terms such as woke, political correctness, etc., or a combination of these factors. Parents must somehow struggle through these influences and provide foundational ideas so that their children can still make informed choices on how they wish to deal with others. So this presentation will provide some basic tenets for cultural competency to help parents inform and empower their children as they work through many of the conflicting messages that they will receive. And so what I'm going to do here is I've got a series of questions I'm going to ask Dr. Wiley, and then we'll also get questions from the audience here too. So at any time, if you have a question, there's a Q&A button there at the bottom. Just go ahead and type your question in there. That way we can keep track of it. There's also a chat box that we may utilize as well. But I always tell people, if you put it in the Q&A, it's much easier for us to keep track of. So let's start off with our first item here. It says, why is cultural competency so important?
Well, the way I see it, our world is becoming just ever more diverse, and that diversity it's not going to go away. I think there are maybe some people out there who would probably like to see it go away and would like to see it become less diverse, but it's not. It's around and it's gonna stay, and we have to learn to adjust to that diversity and enjoy the folks that are around us. As Kelly mentioned in the introduction, there seems to be a lot of things that are happening within the United States where people are just getting so upset by some of the changes that they're seeing around them. And, to a certain extent, I can understand why that bothers some folks, and maybe get a little into that deeper on as we go through the presentation. But overall, the world is going to be just a very different place for our children as they move into it. So, I always feel that cultural competency is just important because it really encourages the acknowledgement and acceptance of all the differences in appearance and behavior and culture that we see out there. And it allows us really to have that ability to understand, communicate effectively with other people, and to be able to interact with those different cultures. And cultural competency is really about being aware of your own worldview while gaining knowledge of different cultures, practices, and other worldviews, and being able to adjust your worldview so that you can work within and help others as they move forward, as you pass through them and talk to them along the way.
So if you had to have a definition of cultural competency that you would use kind of as an overarching kind of thing, what would that be?
There's a couple that I really like. First off, there's probably a gazillion definitions of cultural competency, and it's really out there. And I would encourage everybody, if you're looking for a definition, just kind of look up and, say, hey, how would you define cultural competency, and see what other things are out there. And then it's kind of about really taking a look at those and figuring out which ones work best for you. I worked a lot in the social services industry, so I tend to like the definitions that talk about how we're going to provide service to people and that kind of thing. So there's one that, for instance, that the Child Welfare League of America used, and they defined cultural competency as the ability of individuals and systems to respond respectfully and effectively to people of all cultures, classes, races, ethnic backgrounds, sexual orientations, and faiths or religions in a manner that recognizes, affirms, and values the worth of individuals, families, tribes, communities, and protects and preserves the dignity of each. I like that definition if you're looking for something that you're going to use within your organization, especially if your organization is a social services type organization. But on a personal level, I really like this one, this other definition that a staff member from the Child Welfare League quoted as saying, it's much simpler and cleaner, and that is that cultural competency means being aware of your own cultural beliefs and values and how these may be different from other cultures, including being able to learn about and honor the different cultures of those you work with. And that's the one that I kind of like to use from as my own personal way of thinking about cultural competency and how I would really define it and how it kind of impacts me, because it really just talks about understanding yourself, your cultural beliefs and values, and figuring out how those may interact with other different cultures, and that ability to kind of honor those different cultures that you work with.
So then on that definition, so how would you know that you're culturally competent? How would you assess that for yourself, do you think?
Well, so the interesting thing about that, that question is, cultural competency, it's really a lifelong pursuit. It's not something that you can kind of just wake up one day and say, oh, I consider the feelings of somebody else, I'm culturally competent, and you're done. It doesn't really work like that. In fact, you'd never really become fully culturally competent. Um, and I've known many people that are as culturally competent as they can be. They're some of the, wonderful, most caring individuals. And I've seen those people make huge mistakes around cultural competency and kind of mess up and, and make an error when dealing with a culture that they're not familiar with or an ethnic group that they're not familiar with. What I think that those people do really well, though, is they're quick. They understand when they've made that mistake. They're good at reading people's body language, figuring that out, and then going back and acknowledging, hey, I made an error. Can we talk about where the error was? What was it that was offensive? How do we step back? And then they go back and they try to figure out ways to continue to move forward. And that's where I think, the people that are best at being culturally competent are at.
So why do you think it's so hard to be culturally competent? I mean, one might say, just as long as I'm nice, am I not culturally competent? But that's not the case, I'm thinking.
Yeah, you're right about that. And I would kind of say that's sort of a trick question, because it's not really that hard to be culturally competent. But what it's easier to do for us is to be able to label, stereotype others. We are we are bombarded by tons of information every day. If you think about all the things that your sensors, your eyes, your ears, your nose, your skin have to take in on a daily basis, and all of the different interactions that you have to have with different people and all of those other kind of things that you have to do, we have to figure out a way of kind of making sense of all of those things. And that's where what makes cultural competency a little bit harder, because now you're adding in these other variables that you probably didn't really want to have to, it would be easier to not necessarily have to deal with. And so that's why we sometimes fall back on labeling and stereotyping and things like that, because it just makes it a lot easier for us to make sense of all the various kind of input and stimuli that we're getting when we interact with some of these other different cultures and ethnic groups.
So with cultural competency, obviously there's the notion of diversity. And so if you're going to value diversity, what does that mean?
So this is, diversity and valuing diversity is one of those kind of main tenets that you want to think about when you're especially working with some of your children. And it's really about how do you teach them to respect all cultures. And what I think we get into a lot of times is we spend a lot of times just being tolerant of people, but not necessarily being respectful of the differing backgrounds and viewpoints. And then the other thing that really is difficult, is a little bit more difficult for us when we're trying to value diversity, is learning how to consider the differences that we see, that diversity that we see, and considering the strengths of the other groups, and really saying, okay, that's different than the way I would do it, but it is, I see how that's a method that could really work well for another group, or the way that they function. So there's a lot of self-awareness that really has to go into how you're looking at, and how you're really valuing the diversity of all these other cultures and ethnic groups that you might encounter.
So you mentioned self-awareness. So how does one become self-aware? That may be a big question there.
hmm I think that one of the best ways, or one of the things that you can really do about it, and of course, there is no single method of doing these things. So when I say the best way, a lot of times I'm talking from my own experience, but it's really good that when you recognize your own kind of personal biases against people of different cultures, and you work to eliminate them. If you feel that, if you can recognize that bias, if you can look into yourself and say, hey, I do have this bias about a certain group of people. Where does it come from? Is it valid? How do, you know, what makes it me think the way that I'm thinking? Is it something that I was raised? Was I raised with this type of a bias? Did I pick it up somewhere else along the way? Um, and one of the things that I like to do is, when I have a bias like that, I use I go out and I do a little bit of research, and I start to think, well, how valid is this bias that I have? How valid, what stereotypes is it based on? And can I really find supporting evidence that says my bias is actually correct? Um, I used to teach a lot of classes, and when I was teaching those classes, and I especially was teaching a lot on stereotypes and stereotyping, I used to use big-haired women as an example, because, and I would say I had this bias that big-haired women were always loud, and I don't know why I thought that, and why it was something, but I did a quick, you know, internet search, and you find out, hey, big-haired women, there's no evidence to support my bias, and no evidence to support why I stereotype folks that way. And so I was able to eliminate that bias by just doing a little bit more research, and really looking into and seeing what the facts were about it.
That's interesting. So big-haired women. So are we talking 80s, or are we talking
Yeah, yeah.
contemporary?
I was teaching back in the kind of 80s, late 90s.
Oh, okay. Anyway,
So
sorry.
it was something that was more prevalent then.
Back then, yeah. So what are the dynamics of difference then? So, uh, everybody's different, and you just mentioned big hair for a person that kind of sets them apart. So how do you get through that? How do you go through the differences and help figure these things out?
The interesting thing about that is, as you start to learn more and more about people, and learn more about what the differences are and the things that make them up, you have to learn how to you can deal with or accept, or and sometimes it's just being aware. And there are so many things that create issues within various different cultures, and a lot of these things have to do with body language differences. A lot of cultures, the way culture manages their socioeconomic factors, their socio-cultural factors, with how they relate with their parents, how they relate with their children, how they relate with their other family members. Um, there's also things about how a person may define their health, their how, yeah, the health, well, how they define a family, work obligations, their faith. These are all things that are not necessarily always going to be the same as the way you might do it. And what's interesting is if you're not careful about how they do these things, you're the dynamics that are inherent when two cultures interact. They may clash because of the way these differences have been put together, come together. So, not sure what that was. Okay. um, so if you're not real careful about understanding some of these differences in communication or some of these other things that go on, a lot of times misinterpretations or misjudgments may occur. And it's really important that as an individual, you learn to accept responsibility in the interaction so that you're not just making it a one-sided kind of a combination. If you're not always just making it so that the other person has to adapt to you, but you're working to adapt and, you know, adapt and to them as well. And I just want to one quick example of kind of cultural differences is in a lot of cultures, for instance, the physical distance that you have when communicating with them, and many of us learn around this. So for instance, a lot of Spanish cultures, they talk very close. They can be very close when they talk to each other, whereas in the United States, here we tend to like a little more space, and within our we get uncomfortable when people kind of enter into our personal space. And so you can see people, I've seen people conversations where a person from a Spanish country is talking and they keep moving closer to somebody from the United States, and the person in the United States keeps moving farther away, and they keep going like that and that until they've actually practically walked across the room. So learning how to balance that out and how to manage that within the interaction is always difficult, and it's just something that both sides of the conversation have to learn how to accept responsibility for.
I think of a Seinfeld episode where the Judge Reinhold is a close talker.
Yes,
and they go on and on about the close talker, and then you can see the characters from the show reaction as he is interacting with them.
Yeah, and there was some very different reactions, right? Kramer
right.
practically falls over a table trying to back away from him,
right.
and Jerry sort of embraces it and gets right in his face.
right. Trying to push him back or something, I guess.
Yeah.
But you mentioned a little bit ago responsibility, right? So you're saying people need to accept their responsibility, which seems like a fairly easy thing to do, but it doesn't seem like people do that. So why do you think that is?
I think because it's generally it's not the easiest thing in the world to do. It's not often to when you're talking about accepting responsibility, you kind of have to admit to yourself that you might not be doing this correctly, that you may have messed up somewhere, there may be a mistake along the same lines, and that's sometimes hard for people to initially kind of come to deal with. And so we like to look at things through our lenses, through how we've learned to interpret and share stuff. We're not as easy to kind of, really basically put ourselves in other people's shoes and kind of look at things through their lens. The other thing about accepting responsibility is, there's a lot of isms out there, racism, classism, ageism, sexism, homophobia, other biases and discrimination that occur out there. And, I like to think of the best really cultural competency people as the ones that really help to combat these things. They're out there, kind of not, when they see this kind of intolerant behavior or something going on along the lines, they step up and they say something about it and they do something about it. And, that's also something that we're not inherently comfortable doing, interjecting, in certain areas.
So if you're going to take on the responsibility, then you need to learn about other cultures. And so what would you give some tips on how you would learn about other cultures.
Um, I think one of the easiest, really, and kind of the first steps, and that I like to say to people is, hey, don't be afraid to ask questions. Um, we often, again, we don't like to embarrass ourselves. We don't like to come across as seeming ignorant, or, you know, we don't want to, be humiliated at any point. And so we often sometimes avoid asking the questions. And then what we end up doing is falling back on the stereotypes of what we think we know about a culture or an ethnic group, or as opposed to really trying to become more familiar with all the aspects of the culture that you're interacting with. Um, and you'd be amazed at how often when you ask questions and people will sit back and they'll say, oh, well, let me tell you about that. And generally appreciate the fact that you're showing an interest in a lot of the things that you're doing. Uh, I also think it's just really important as an individual, as you learn things about other cultures, especially things that tend to kind of break through some of the stereotypical walls that are out there. It's great to kind of share that knowledge, and help other people to understand, hey, there's a couple of ways of really seeing this and learning from it as well.
So, but with so many cultures and so many different groups and so forth, I mean, can you really adapt to them all? I mean, is it feasible?
No, I mean, not really. Um, you're every day you're going to, depending upon where you live. I lived in the Bay Area for about 20 years. That's out in California, it's near San Francisco, and it was constantly, encountering different groups, and different ethnic groups, and and every time you encounter somebody different, it was, basically starting over that whole learning process again, and learning about them, and understanding things that they have. So it's not really possible to adapt to all of them, but showing that willingness to interact, to learn more about them, to discuss their culture, to this is really what it's all about.
So what you're saying is just like, whenever you kids are younger, they're like, oh, I finally out of school, but you never are out of school because you always have to keep learning something. There's
Exactly.
never a point where you're not going to be doing anything. And so that same approach needs to be taken with cultural competence, so that
Right.
you never stop. It's not,
Right.
there's no, there's no end to it, as
Right.
it were. So,
Yeah, one of my favorite psychologists, he actually, this is Dr. Cross, and he's, talked about cultural competency, and he basically said cultural competence is a developmental process that evolves over time rather than being a static one-time achievement.
oh, okay.
And
Hey, there you go.
that's really, that's it, right? It's you're gonna keep changing, but the thing that you can do is, if you do things like, work on, valuing diversity of different groups, becoming more self-aware, some of those things we talked about, really, work on your awareness and acceptance of the differences of other groups, understand that, how these differences might play off each other, and they're more dynamic along those lines, and then, work on accepting more responsibility for learning about other cultures and things. If you can, work on those things within yourself, and you can, pass that information along, especially with, your children, you'll help to develop kids who are more culturally competent and more responsive to the other groups that they come across and they see, and they'll be more practice at it as they go through the world and grow older.
So I know you're not going to believe this, but pretty much everybody in my household can speak another language except for me. And so what's the difference between cultural competence versus being a bilingual person or having the literacy in another language?
Um, yeah, that's a really good question. What I have seen a lot of times is organizations rely very heavily on bilingual literacy versus actually focusing on cultural competence. So you may walk into an agency and that agency says, "Hey, we're very culturally competent because we have, 85% of our staff speak a second language." Um, and in some cases, though, their cultural competence can be called into question because while the people may be bilingual, they're still not very culturally competent because they still have a lot of biases of their own that they're dealing with and haven't really worked through. So, it's I think being bilingual is fantastic. It's great for an organization when they can have more bilingual staff in there, but it's not the thing. It's not going to guarantee that a team or a group is going to always be culturally competent. It can help, but it's not the one and only thing that's going to affect it. So you still need to show that willingness to adapt.
Just because you know the language doesn't mean you know the culture.
Exactly.
Hmm,
Exactly.
interesting. So can you give us some examples, real world examples of cultural competence and maybe even the opposite? So the kind of the do's and don'ts, cultural competency, as I suppose, the lack of cultural competence or examples of being culturally competent.
Um, the I one of the best examples that I know of organizations really you doing being culturally competent has to do with the Oakland School District. The Oakland School District uh, was working. Actually, also, I'm not sure how many of you have heard about Ebonics, and Ebonics gets kind of a bad rap throughout, so to speak, throughout the world. But the Oakland School District took Ebonics and they basically adopted it so that it could be used as a tool to help with the educational programs. And it was highly successful. It really improved, and not to go too much into the mechanics of it, but it really improved the ability of students to learn throughout the school system. And what they did is they used Ebonics as a way of reaching the kids, and basically taught the kids when to use Ebonics, when to use standard English, and back and forth, and so that the kids could translate, and essentially turn the kids into bilingual. And it was really actually quite a successful program. Unfortunately, it ended up getting scrapped because people kind of thought that it was, people just didn't like the way Ebonics sounded. They just had some real biases against it. And a lot of people like Jesse Jackson, even Oprah Winfrey, kind of got in the middle of this and started talking about, hey, we shouldn't be teaching our kids Ebonics because that's not standard English and blah, 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 and things like that. And it ended up, boom, getting scrapped. And it was just not, it kind of really impacted the way the school was able to do the learning. But it was actually one of the, if you ever get a chance to kind of read up on the overall Ebonics program and how it was implemented in the Oakland School District, it's fascinating how it evolved and how it ended up getting shot down. But in terms of an example where organizations use cultural competency to improve their system, I think it's one of the best.
Well, that's interesting because you do have to, if you want to reach people, especially in the social services and so forth, you have to go to where they are. You can't expect everybody to come to you or expect everybody to have, everything that you have. You have to really, try to find situations that are identifiable between you in order to get points across. It's not like it's, everybody's different and you have to be different sometimes in order to connect.
Yeah.
um, because I think it's hard. I mean, it's got to be hard. I can only imagine. I don't have to necessarily do that too much in my work, but it's got to be difficult sometimes, especially because there's biases on both sides, I would assume. You know, even though culturally competent doesn't mean that your culture isn't valued. It means all cultures are valued, I'm assuming. And so you may be two people on either side of different cultures, and either one of them doesn't understand each other.
Yeah, and it used to. This was one of the most amazing when I was working in a social services organization back in California. We had requirements that everybody had to do a treatment plan. And when doing the treatment plan, on the treatment plan, you had to basically, list some of the culturally competent things that you saw that were going on with an individual in there. And it was always very interesting that a lot of times with many of the white clients, the therapist would automatically write in NA, not applicable. And I would go crazy because I guess I shouldn't say that since it was a behavioral health anyway. But anyways, because I would say to them, everybody has culture. Everybody has, some type of, ethnicity. Everybody has something within it. You just have to look. You have to ask the questions, and you have to ask the right questions. And these were trained therapists who are trained in asking questions, and they weren't doing a very good job of asking the culturally competent and culturally relevant questions.
I think the media, and just on this topic here, I think the media always um, pushes the fact that other cultures are not whatever the media is portraying. So, pick your poison, as it were, in the media, and whatever the predominance is in that media organization, they assume all other cultures are what you're being culturally competent of, not what they're involved in, I'm assuming. And just because of the way people think sometimes. For instance, earlier today, I was in a program on the adverse childhood trauma. And the speaker on that one, he and I had a very similar upbringing. So we're both about the same age. We both grew up in a rural community, with a very small, school and so forth. And so that is a culture. There is a culture to that. And he was talking about corporal punishment and how, when he was young, spankings and stuff like that were all the norm, and
Right.
how it's not very effective whenever you're raising your children to do all that, because it just teaches them that violence is somehow going to solve things when it doesn't. But we had that same experience, whereas somebody who's in a different setting may have a different experience, and that becomes a bit cultural in rural versus urban and so forth and all that. So it is quite interesting. Sorry, I'm expounding a little bit on this, but I did think about that from earlier today, and I thought that it's kind of interesting, because that in itself is a culture.
It is, and and it's when you talk about examples of that's one of those kind of negative examples of people being the lack of cultural competency. And we were an agency that we really prided ourselves on being a strong culturally competent agency, but somewhere along the line the training missed this, and it was just assumed, hey, this is the dominant culture, and so as the dominant, they don't really have a culture. It's kind of weird.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, if anybody has questions, you can go ahead and type them into the Q&A, and we'll do a little Q&A session. What I'm going to do is I'm also going to open it up so folks can ask their own question if they'd like to. And all you have to do is unmute yourself, and you can ask your own question if you'd like. There we go. So that way you can either type it in and I'll ask it, or if you want to If you want to just unmute your microphone, you can ask your question on your own. So, but I want to thank Dr. Wiley for being here tonight and talking to us all about this. This is an important topic. As people are thinking about if they've got a question for you, is there any kind of parting words that you'd like to share with us?
And like I said, I think there are some, just kind of basic tenets, and if I was going to review those, I would say, valuing diversity, um, being self-aware, uh, developing an awareness and acceptances of the differences that you might see within folks, understanding how the dynamics of differences kind of interact with each other and can kind of, sometimes they can lead to misinterpretations or misjudgments, and be ready to kind of accept responsibility to fix that if something like that happens along. um, those would be the things that I think really help an individual. Those are the things that I kind of live by in terms of my dealing with other cultures, and just staying open-minded.